Dear students, welcome to another lecture on development administration. Today, we will discuss bureaucracy, its reforms and development. The primary objectives of this lecture are to understand the definition of administrative or bureaucratic reforms, to conceptualize the importance of reforms in bureaucracy, to contextualize the major developments of bureaucratic reforms in Indian context, and to evaluate the limitations and successes of bureaucratic reforms in India. Let's start with the introduction. Public administration is a continuous process, and in this sense, it's always undergoing reform. Reforms are an obvious response to the new challenges confronting state institutions managing public affairs. At the root of such an exercise lies the effort at enhancing administrative capability in the changed scenario. The problem of administrative reform has received continuing attention in India, both at the center and in the states. Since independence, there have been a large number of changes in the structure, work methods, and procedures of the administrative organizations. Although these changes have been gradual, at times not too perceptible, they do indicate the efforts made by the government to effect procedural and policy innovation in the administrative system and to keep pace with the changed situations, growing needs, and exigencies of the government. Public administration was born out of a zeal for reforms, and since the publication of Wilson's founding essay in 1887, change and reform have remained a constant refrain of administrative analysis. The initial impulse came from reformers' interest in separating politics from administration, to rid the latter of corruption and to professionalize it. Successive efforts in disciplinary growth were aimed at organizing decision making and policy refinement, behavioral reorientation of employees and managers, and public administration more and more towards the open system, environment sensitive, and client responsive direction. A major breakthrough in recent years was the public choice perspective, posing the market versus state issue, relocating the discipline in a neoliberal political economy perspective. In the third world, public administration became development administration with a new focus, objectives, and modalities of functioning. The development reform nexus has spawned a variety of responses from international agencies like the World Bank as well as from developing countries themselves. Good governance, participative developments, and debureaucratization have gained in importance in conceptualizing contemporary public administration. With this background, the present lecture makes an attempt to understand the concept of administrative reform in Indian context, to analyze the initiatives of reforms after independence, and understand the changing patterns of administrative reforms in India in the post-liberalization era. Now, dear students, let's see what's meant by reforms in bureaucracy. Public administration as an academic discipline was born with a bias towards change and reform. The term reform literally means forming again. Administrative or bureaucratic reform is a deliberately planned exercise to improve public administration. Reforms are meant to improve administrative capability and capacity for the purpose of achieving national goals effectively. It also means to encourage an effective administration to enhance and increase the quality of public services and deliver such goals and services to citizens more economically, efficiently, and effectively. Administration is dynamic and its role is being constantly redefined in response to the changing circumstances in which it is located. Hence, Cadden argues that administrative reform is based on the premise that governments need effective machinery to operationalize their policies and that effective machinery can be designed on rational principles. What it suggests is that A. Administrative reform is about deliberate planned change affecting the society in purview. B. It is synonymous with innovation. C. Improvements in public service efficiency and effectiveness are the intended outcomes of the reforms. And D. The reforms are justified by the need to cope with the uncertainties and rapid changes in the organizational environment. The need for administrative reform arises from the malfunctioning of the natural processes of administrative change. Reform movements begin with the intention of removing obstacles to change or of improving on the result of change where it is being accommodated. The objective of administrative reform, thus, is to improve on the status quo by removing alleged defects, ending ill or wrong ways, and curing administrative faults. According to Cadden, administrative or bureaucratic reforms are needed in the following circumstances: when the administration is obviously failing to meet the demands put on it, when the administration with reserve capacity is unable to anticipate future demands, and when the administration that does have reserve capacity and the ability to anticipate future demands does not adopt the most effective methods. Mosher identifies four major subgoals of administrative reforms: changing operative policies and programs, improvement of administrative effectiveness, higher quality personnel, and more effective staff performance, and anticipating outside criticism or threat. Reform in bureaucracy is episodic in character. Reform is aimed at improving the status quo, and it therefore marks a departure from the prevalent setup. Here, Cadden's distinction between reform and change seems relevant. While the latter is a self-adjusting organizational response to changing conditions, reform is a device to remedy the malfunctioning of the natural administrative process. Reform, unlike change, is therefore a continuous activity seeking to transform the structure, process, and behavior of administration. Attempts at reform are thus directed towards three elements, whether separately or jointly. So, first, structural reform is very common in public administration. The basic concern here is with division of work, delegation, and decentralization, as well as the creation of autonomous agencies and setting up of coordinating mechanism to harmonize the actions of interdependent units. Second is procedural reform is also frequently suggested and pursued in the government organizations. This may involve changes in financial rules, alteration of work procedures, changes in filing methods, forms, and so on, and general attempts to avoid red tape. Application of a battery of management techniques to different administrative situations also belong to this category of reform. Third is behavioral reform, is a relatively new dimension in administrative reform. Here, the focus is on public bureaucracy that has been criticized for its impersonal character and dehumanizing consequences. Behavioral changes have therefore been suggested to improve interpersonal and intergroup relationships within the bureaucracy. Also, such changes are advocated to make the administration serve the public better. Participative management and sensitivity training have gained wide currency in recent times in public administration. Given its wider concern, administrative reforms are very difficult to implement as they represent real or perceived shifts in prevailing authority relationships. As far as implementations of reforms is concerned, Cadden refers to four methods of implementations. Reforms imposed through political revolution. Reforms introduced to remedy organizational rigidity. Reforms through the legal system. And reforms through change in attitudes. Bureaucracy plays a central role in socio-economic development and nation building. It has been observed that the prototypes of patronage, guardian, and caste bureaucracy do not commend themselves for public administration today. We are still raised with the necessity of a basic choice. The choice is between the bureaucrat as a functionary and the bureaucrat as common person. Do we want a bureaucracy that has the courage of its integrity, or do we want a bureaucracy with its ear to the ground? This is a major issue that needs deliberation. The bureaucracy has been the backbone of our system, which is undergoing transformation due to the enhancement of the role of the people in decision making and the changing role of the state. Bureaucrats are confronted with new inputs from contemporary socio-economic and political scene. It is therefore impossible to adhere to the Weberian rigid, rule-bound and hierarchical model of bureaucracy. Instead, the need of the hour is transparent and accountable bureaucratic system. The resources at the disposal of bureaucracy are new channels of information, power of decision making, and political support. These need to be directed towards the achievement of organizational and developmental goals. Modernizing the administrative system and reorganizing the bureaucratic structure has been the two-dimensional strategy adopted by the political leadership in most developing countries to revamp their bureaucracy. The nature of bureaucracy in a single party dominant rule and in a coalition party system has to be different and contextual. It throws open the relevance of rational bureaucracy in the context of third world, as policies may be lost in the thicket of bureaucratic infighting or twisted out of recognition by the bureaucratic apathy and misunderstanding of opposition. Creating and maintaining a responsive and responsible bureaucracy that caters to the general needs and specified goals of developing societies has thus become one of the most complex problems. The renewed role of bureaucracy must satisfy the dual requirement of capacity and control. Capacity indicates the ability of an administrative unit to achieve its objective efficiently. Control refers to accountability due to higher authority, most particularly to elected representative in the legislative branch. The contingency approach points out, seeks to understand the interrelationships within and among the subsystems as well as between the organization and its environment and to define patterns of relationship of variables. It recommends a continuous study to find out how changes in external environment are likely to influence the interdependencies among subsystems and thus their functions. This approach needs to be explored further in order to draw its benefits for the functioning of bureaucracy. Now let's have a look on bureaucracy, reforms and development in India. Turning to the reform scenario in India, one has to run through a long period of bureaucratic ups and downs since the advent of colonial rule. During the imperial rule, the core purpose of administration was to bolster colonialism, where people's interests were absolutely peripheral, if not entirely absent. Hence, administrative reforms had to single a priority of perpetuating British rule. With independence, the nature and the spirit of administration were bound to be radically different since its moral foundation had undergone dramatic changes. The Indian historical experience, both during the British period and its immediate aftermath, led to the emergence of a public administration that was ill suited to the needs and aspirations of the people. The reasons are not difficult to seek, as studies have shown that the bureaucrats who have been brought up and trained in the colonial administrative culture are welded to the barbarian characteristics of hierarchy, status, and rigidity of rules and regulations, and are concerned mainly with the enforcement of law and order and collection of revenues. While this structure was most appropriate for the colonial regime, it's completely unfit to discharge the functions in the changed environment of an administration geared to the task of development. As the government becomes the main institution for development in the democratic setup that India adopted following independence, the role of the officials has undergone changes. Their role objective is to emphasize results rather than hierarchy and status, flexibility and decentralization rather than control and authority. Seen as the development administrator, the bureaucrat should therefore be characterized by tact, pragmatism, dynamism, flexibility, adaptability to any situation, and willingness to take rapid, ad hoc decisions without worrying too much about procedures and protocol. In order to respond to the new challenges, several steps were undertaken in the post 1947 transfer of power. The first step was undoubtedly the formation of the Secretariat Reorganization Committee, appointed by the imperial government even before the actual transfer of power. In its report, submitted in August 1947, the committee commented extensively on the unresponsive nature of the administration that was simply incapable of handling the new challenges in the aftermath of British withdrawal. These years also witnessed the IAS to replace the Indian civil services, such as the Indian Police Service, Indian Foreign Service, the Central Services, as well as the setting up of a training school for the IAS probationers. A comprehensive review of working of the machinery of the central government was undertaken towards the end of 1949 by Gopalaswamy Iyengar Committee, which dealt with organization change, improvements in methods of transaction of governmental business. He recommended a distinction between a ministry and a department. He recommended a new grouping of ministries responsible for economic and social services under the name of bureaus like Bureau for Agriculture and Natural Resources, Industry and Commerce, Transport and Communication, and Labor and Social Service. In 1951, the Planning Commission set up the Ghorwala Committee to consider whether the existing administrative machinery and methods were adequate to the requirements of planet development. The main finding of the committee was that the public was experiencing delay in execution and there was a lack of integrity and undue interference and corruption and lack of involvement of officials. It recommended a reorganization of the government for greater speed, efficiency, effectiveness, and responsiveness. The committee even suggested that a minister and a secretary be appointed solely for pursuing administrative reforms and its promotion. An important landmark in the area of administrative reforms goes back to Paul H. Appleby's two reports on Indian administration. In its first report, Public Administration in India, Report of a Survey, 1953, it recommended for the establishment of an O and M. O stands for organization and M for methods. Organization in the central government and the setting up of an institution of public administration, which was adopted immediately. Appleby's second report, Reorganization of India's Administrative System, with special reference to administration of government's industrial and commercial enterprise, was submitted in 1956. In his reports, Paul Appleby suggested radical reforms of the administrative structure that was archaic, feudalistic, and inadequate to fulfill the primary goal of the nation with a long history of colonialism. What was most surprising to him was the acceptance of an administrative machine simply because of its instrumental significance. As a result, the later structural changes were believed to be crucial in radically altering the inherent ideological foundation of Indian public administration. The report of the Second Pay Commission, 1957 to 59, is illustrative here. Appointed in 1957, the primary task of the Commission was to examine the principles that should govern the structure of emoluments and conditions of service of central government employees. In order to ascertain efficiency, the Commission suggested the classification of government offices into attached and subordinate offices on a functional basis and bringing the relevant secretariat and the attached offices under a single headquarter organization. The other remarkable recommendation was about the creation of machinery for negotiation and settlement of disputes between employers and employees. The growing corruption in administration led to the appointment of the Santhanam Committee in 1964 that looked into the problem of administrative corruption. The committee examined the organization and working of the vigilance units in central ministries and departments, suggested changes in conduct rules applicable to government servants, and recommended for the creation of the Central Vigilance Commission as a permanent administrative wing to keep a sustained watch on civil servants. As a result of its recommendations, the Central Vigilance Commission was set up by the Government of India. The most comprehensive inquiry ever taken in the aftermath of decolonization was the Administrative Reforms Commission that came into being in 1966 under the stewardship of Desai. It was patterned after the Hoover Commission of the US set up in the post-Second World War period, having a political and civil servant membership with experts coming in to write reports after study and research. Two important ideas seem to have governed the constitution of the commission. First, the changing nature of administration from a mere law and order maintenance agency to an apparatus responsible for development, radically altered the traditional concept of administration. Second, the ideological goal of a socialist pattern of society called for a drastic overhauling of the machinery of government that so far discharged the responsibility in a very stereotypical manner. So, the Commission was given a very wide mandate and was entrusted with the task of giving consideration to the need for ensuring the highest standard of efficiency and integrity in the public service and for making public administration a fit instrument for carrying out the social and economic goals of development, as also one which is responsive to the public. The most significant recommendations happen to be the appointment of the Lokpal and the Lok Ayukta apart from the introduction of the concept and technique of performance budgeting. As a consequence of the ARC report, the Lokpal and Lok Ayuktas Bill 1968 was introduced in Lok Sabha in the year 1968. Unfortunately, it could not be passed in the Rajya Sabha. Though introduced in the parliament 3 times, the Lokpal bill has not been passed. But so far 9 states have adopted some variations of the ombudsman proposal. Mass mobilization by social activist Anna Hazare has pressurized the government to pass the Lokpal bill in the parliament. It has been a major step in preventing public corruption in the country. Information technology is emerging as a major instrument for ushering in administrative reforms. The objective is to empower the citizens as well as the administrators. A major initiative taken by the government for ushering in e-governance on a national scale called the National E-Governance Plan (NEGP) was approved on 16 May 2006. The NEGP consists of 27 mission mode projects MMPs, encompassing central MMPs, 11 state MMPs, and 7 integrated MMPs that span multiple back-end ministries departments. It's being implemented at the central, state, and local government levels. The Indian Portal Project is an MMP under the NEGP, which aims at providing a single window access to the information and services of the Indian government at all levels, from central government to state government to district administration and panchayats for the citizens, business, and overseas Indians. The e-governance initiatives introduced by various government agencies include the setting up of single window system in government offices, public grievance redressal system, creation of online reservation in domestic rail and air travel, and so on. This has benefited the general public by improving the quality in delivering of services of these agencies. Girish Pradhan assumes that in a country like India, if access to IT were not restricted because of poor infrastructure, high costs, and lack of opportunity, the benefits in terms of savings would be phenomenal. The only area of concern is that in a country that already has so many divisions and differences, another division in the form of a digital divide cannot be encouraged. Therefore, one of the challenges in e-governance would be to allow access to the maximum number of deprived and weaker sections of society through such common facilities as can be created whether by government or better still private initiative. Now, dear students, let's conclude our lecture. Reform efforts in Indian bureaucracy have been based on the assumption that Indian administration has to be freed from its colonial baggage to be able to respond to dynamic development environment. The purpose of reform has been to reorient the civil services into a dynamic, efficient, and accountable apparatus for public service delivery. The initial phase of administrative reform, which began in 1947 and continued until 1990, was characterized by several internal shifts, as shown by numerous administrative reforms committees and commissions. Recommendations for reform were numerous, but implementation of them was poor, tardy, uneven, and on the whole unimpressive. As a result, public administration of independent India, rooted as it was in the colonial culture, remained blithely unchanged in its basic structure of administration, procedure of work, and attitudes, and orientation of public bureaucracy. So, dear students, I hope you have gained important information about bureaucracy, its reforms, and development. See you soon with another lecture. Till then, take care. Goodbye.